Okay, so today we would do a special type of ELISA. And it's slightly different from your typical sandwich ELISA. These types of ELISAs are frequently used diagnostically, and what they are doing at the end of the day, they're measuring the presence of a particular antibody in someone's blood. And why would this be useful? So you're measuring the presence of specific antibodies in blood. So if, for example, I've been infected with HIV, and assuming I had the infection for at least a couple of weeks, so I have enough antibody titer, what do you think? Would I be making antibody against HIV? We do. Anything you get exposed to, whether you win it or not, meaning whether you clear it or not, you would carry those antibodies. So by testing the presence of those antibodies, you're confirming that the person has been exposed to whatever you are looking for. Would you be able to pick up the antibody if the person has been exposed a couple of nights before to HIV? Probably not, because it does take some time for innate immunity to kick in and get the antibodies. So it has its limitations. In many cases nowadays, because sensitivity is critical, for example, you're collecting blood and you want to make sure there are no diseases in the blood, they would use what's referred to as qPCR or real-time RT-qPCR, which is way more sensitive. And that one relies on nucleic acids. However, if we're dealing with an autoimmune disease, that involves antibodies, basically you start generating antibodies against certain tissues, certain molecules in your own body, then this would be useful. For example, a good example would be lupus. And lupus, you generate antibodies against your own DNA. You shouldn't, but it happens. Now, as I said, lupus involves, if this is your DNA, and the DNA is wrapped around histones too, by the way. So you start making antibodies against your own DNA. So the idea, if you're suspecting that someone has lupus, they call it SLE, by the way, which stands for systemic lupus erythematosus. It's primarily a female disease. erythromatus actually. But don't worry, the boys have their own autoimmune diseases too. MS, multiple sclerosis would be one, which doesn't involve so much antibodies. It actually involves reactive T cells targeting your nervous system. So, how would you create an ELISA to measure the presence of an antibody which recognizes your own DNA, but it should not? It's not supposed to recognize your own DNA. You could take an ELISA plate and you could code it with DNA, right? So this is done, you covalently link the DNA onto the plate. Then, if this is the patient's blood, we're going to let it coagulate, spin it down, and we're going to collect the serum. We could use the plasma, but in this particular case, it's preferable to use the serum. All you have to do, let the blood coagulate, spin it down, and this is what you're going to get. This is the serum part. A serum has many, many things. So in many cases, you would dilute your serum. And you dilute it for a number of reasons. You also want to see if you're diluting it, if you're losing the signal, which you might be perceiving as positive signal. If you keep diluting it, it should not be changing. In other words, if you have those antibodies, even if you dilute it, the signal you get should be pretty much staying the same. If, on the other hand, you have something non-specific, in other words, the antibodies you have, they just like to linger around your DNA, and you are getting a signal, and you are thinking, oh, this person has antibodies against your DNA. If you're diluting, what do you think should happen to the signal? Remember, this is a non-specific interaction.
You start losing signals.
Exactly. So if you're losing the signal as you're diluting the serum, it indicates it's non-specific, and there's a good possibility that maybe they don't have those antibodies that you are looking for. So you have to be careful with these assays. So you want to include these controls. Okay? So, if this is the patient's serum, and if it contains the antibodies you were looking for, now, would this be the only antibodies? It wouldn't, right? So it's a very rich sample, if you like. So you always have to worry about non-specific binding. So non-specific binding is always a possibility. So it would be a false positive. But you're hoping by doing the dilutions that you would see something that would provide evidence that you are having non-specific binding. Okay. So, assuming that the patient has these antibodies. Now, and you always, I guess you link this with clinical manifestations. There are clinical signs on a person that they have lupus. My understanding is that they have redishness on their skin, and you won't rely just on one thing. You would look at many things. So, assuming this is the case, so you put the patient sample with this special ELISA plate which contains DNA, human DNA, and it binds. Okay, so that's a step. We completed this. what should we do next to confirm? So you do this step, and of course then you're going to wash. When you're washing, the antibodies will still be there. It's a strong interaction. It's not covalent, but it's strong enough. Okay. So you do this thing. How would you detect that the antibody is on the DNA? Take a wild guess. How did we detect the TNF alpha? Yeah.
You find a comma to it. What is it called? The markers that you can see. Some kind of detection.
Oh, so how about using a detection antibody? But that's a little bit strange. I'm using an antibody to recognize another antibody. That's not an issue. If I take your antibodies and I inject it in a mouse, because those are human antibodies, what do you think the mouse is going to do?
Reject.
It's going to generate antibodies against your antibody. Right? And this, most likely, there would be IgG antibodies. So what it's going to do, if this is the human antibody which was injected in some type of a host, what you would generate is an antibody recognizing the Fc portion of the human antibody. Okay? And of course, chances are you would biotinylate this antibody. And the reason you're biotinylating is because you're going to be using a detector, which is the same detector we use in regular ELISA, which is made up of two things. It's made up of avidin, and avidin recognizes vitamin B7, that's a biotin. And of course, this part is going to be the enzyme part, which in many cases is a horseradish peroxidase, which would take your TMB and give you a nice bluish color or yellow. Okay? So that's the idea. So we go through this, then we bring in our special antibody which recognizes the Fc portion of the antibody. Of course, there will be washes. And many times you combine this step together. In other words, your detection antibody is combined with the enzyme. The enzyme is only going to pay attention to this one. And your antibody is going to be paying attention to binding to the human antibody. So these things could be done at the same time. You don't have to do them in a separate step. Actually, the affinity of the detector towards biotin is stronger than the affinity of the antibody towards the other antibody. It has a KD of 10 to the minus 14. That's how we measure affinity for something. It's a dissociation constant. The lower it is, the higher the association. Okay? So this is the idea. So the virtual ELISA we are going to do has 3 different patients. If you do it properly, you would see that one patient has antibodies, which means they have lupus. The other person is questionable. And the third person does not have antibodies. But principle-wise, this is what you're doing. Now, do you understand the story with diluting the serum. What's the purpose of diluting the serum? Why you bother diluting the serum? What are you trying to prove?
That it's an ongoing. That there's ongoing antibodies no matter how far down you go into the blood.
Yes. So the idea is even though you're diluting the patient's serum, those antibodies that they have high affinity for the DNA. And even if you diluted them, they would still do their job. On the other hand, if you're dealing with non-specific binding, meaning plenty of antibody lingering around DNA and like to interact with it weakly, as you're diluting, you would be losing the signal. So if you have a patient who exhibits this behavior as you're diluting their blood, you're not picking up signal, that's an indication towards non-specific binding. So in that particular patient, you cannot conclusively say. Even in the one which you still get the signal no matter what, it's a strong suggestion.
So that's what's going to happen with a patient that maybe has it, maybe not sure.
Yeah.
The more you dilute it, the more he's going to go with.
Yeah. So if I were to put them in terms of having the disease and not having the disease, the one which I would say there's a good possibility they have it is the one which, even if I'm diluting their serum, nothing happens. In the middle, I will have the patient which I'm picking up something at a particular concentration, but I'm losing it. So for that one, I would say maybe they don't have it. And if I'm picking nothing, I know for sure they don't have it. Okay? So you understand the concept of dilution. I think that should be all right. So let's stop this.